Okay, 3, 2, 1, let's go. Hi, good day, and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashwaq Kareem, and I'm joined again today by Andreas Krieg. Andreas, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Andreas, thanks for making time. We're having you on today because 3 nights ago, we're recording this at the moment on Tuesday morning, so it's about 3.5 nights ago, Israel and the US attacked Iran. Since then, they've bombed a few military installations in Iran. They've bombed, a few government buildings as well, communication buildings. And Iran has responded by putting out a slew of drones and bombs across the Arab world. They've attacked Israel, they've attacked Qatar, they've attacked the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Jordan mildly, Kuwait, a few other countries, Bahrain. What's going on? What do you make of it? But more specifically, what do you make of Iran's response? Why are they doing this?
I think everyone is shocked in the Gulf right now in terms of how far Iran is going to go. But it seems like Iran feels like they're backed into a corner. They have no other way to escape. They are fighting for their survival. Obviously, their supreme leader has been killed. There's been a degradation of the core of this network state. And so they're feeling intensely insecure, and they've basically delegated most of their activity to local forces. This is what the Iranians call mosaic defense. It's the idea that you delegate defense to the periphery, to the local level, where tactical decisions, even operational decisions, are made by local units without having to go back to the central command and the command and control system, which is a fairly resilient way of sustaining a degradation campaign, which is what Iran is involved in at the moment, or it's subjected to. They're being degraded at the core. And usually a decapitation or degradation strategy, such as the one that the Israelis and the Americans are running, would very immediately lead to paralysis across the entire security sector, making it unable for the security sector to respond and to defend. And so the Iranians were preparing for this for the last 8 months by delegating it to the local level. The way that it seems to work is that they have been giving target lists to local units to basically fire at across the GCC, across the Gulf. There are a variety of different categories. I think initially they were going after military targets, US military targets in the first waves on Saturday. And then they really branched out to attack critical national infrastructure across the Gulf, like airports and ports and energy infrastructure. And then, going after civilian targets as well, hotels where they were allegedly saying Americans or Israelis were staying. And obviously, essentially what they're trying to do now is trying to degrade the livelihood or attack the very center of gravity of the livelihood or the way of life in the Gulf, and thereby forcing the Gulf to then put pressure on Trump to stop the war, which is a very absurd thing to do. I mean, Oman and Qatar anyway were always going to lobby the Trump administration to make this as short as possible a war, or obviously have done a lot to basically prevent Trump from going to war in the first place. And now to punish these countries and inflicting pain on them to do something they would have done anyway is extremely counterproductive. And the worrying thing is that, like I said, it's been done apparently from the local level with very little buy-in from the center. So even if the Qataris and the Omanis are now speaking to the heart, to the core of what is left of the regime, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can then translate this into activity on the ground, because a lot of it has been delegated and decentralized.
Okay, so I mean, a lot of issues you picked up on there, which explains the complication of it. I completely agree. I was actually flabbergasted as to why they were hitting some soft targets in Qatar and Oman specifically, even across the other regions of the Gulf, quite frankly, but those two countries specifically. Something we've been speaking about, me and you and other people on the podcast a lot, is sort of how there's been a split between the Saudis and the UAE. And obviously, on the approach of Iran, there was a Saudi approach along with the US and Iran, and there's an Israeli approach along with the US and Iran. And basically, the summary is, the Israelis want to degrade the state as much as possible, probably would love to see it dismembered, have a few secessionist states in it. And the Saudis probably wouldn't mind, a bit of a change in leadership, a leadership that's more friendly to the West, and so with the USA. Now, obviously, this response by the Iranians have risked a response that's probably going to, potentially lead into the Israeli sort of game plan. What's your thoughts on that?
It's a slippery slope, and I think the problem with the Gulf states, and generally, is there are six Gulf monarchies, but they are they're not acting as one. And there is a Peninsula Shield Force and there is a united GCC strategic command. And they allegedly obviously do exercises together. But in terms of integrating their forces and acting as one operationally, let alone strategically, is something that is a bit of a myth and certainly hasn't happened over the last 10 years because of all kinds of disruptions within the Gulf, infighting between different member states and whatnot. So it's difficult to say what is the Gulf going to do collectively about this. But what is clear that at this point, all the GCC states have been subjected to indiscriminate fire from Iran, something they cannot sustain and something they cannot accept. So they have to somewhat reestablish a level or balance of deterrence that favors the Gulf. At the moment, they're being subjected to incoming fire with very little to put in its place. Obviously, they've got their intercepting missiles, but even these air defense systems will not last forever because they will deplete the stockpile of intercepting missiles. So what they've now done, the Gulf states, is moving into forward defense, where they're trying to use their air power and like planes and air-to-air missiles to take down drones and incoming missiles. That has been somewhat successful. Yesterday, the Qataris were downing two bombers, strategic bombers that came into Qatari airspace from Iran and basically eliminated them over the water. But this is a slippery slope where you gradually move the defensive line further and further towards Iran. There has been talk now by the UK. Obviously, there is a joint squadron between the Royal Air Force and the Qatari Air Force. There's been talk to move forward defense to such a level that you would actually take down missiles and drones at source. That means you would use standoff munitions outside of Iranian airspace and shoot down launchers inside Iran. So what we're seeing is a gradual move towards attacking Iran directly. I mean, it wouldn't be attack; it would be still defensive, but you're taking military action inside Iran. So that is in itself quite problematic because we're going closer and closer to a situation where the Gulf states are basically getting involved in this war. But all of them have made it very clear that if they get involved, when they get involved, they're not interested in regime change. They're not there to degrade Iranian capabilities, except for those capabilities that are directly inflicting pain on them. And so I think Iran is miscalculating a little bit of how this would turn out. I think they probably thought, and I don't know what they actually thought, because strategic it doesn't make absolutely no sense. You can't pressure a mediator to mediate even harder when the other party, in this case the Americans, are unwilling to actually make any concessions. So I don't know what they really wanted to achieve with this. I think it was a strategic miscalculation. But now you're getting to a situation where the Gulf states might actually take more offensive action to repel and deter the Iranians. And so we're moving from deterrence, but basically we're moving from air defense and a defensive posture to deterrence by denial that could become deterrence by punishment. So it's a very slippery slope.
Okay, so I mean, as we speak, Israel and the U.S. are still hitting targets in Iran. They obviously are quite happy that, I'm assuming Israel especially is quite happy. Maybe the U.S. not so much because they have got the GCC and many of those countries are its allies and friends. But Israel is probably very happy that, most of Iran's damage is currently going to the GCC. Very little is going to Israel. They are striking Israel. Israel's air defense systems may also get depleted in a while. But I mean, just how happy do you think Benjamin Netanyahu is based on the with Iran's response, based on what we both agree seems to be a very careless, not well thought of strategic move?
For the Israelis, this was the calculus. I think they were hoping for Iran to do that. This is a scenario that all sides have been planning for years and decades. Hitting oil and gas infrastructure, logistics infrastructure, and so on. So it was to be expected. And so Israel was expecting this to happen, and they are hoping that at least Saudi and the UAE would come and join the US-led war. But they obviously, like I said, there's a lot of layers of escalation that would have to happen for this to actually happen. Neither the UAE nor the Saudis, definitely not the Saudis, want to be part of this war. They don't want to be part of an Israeli campaign right now. And so all these rumors that have been spread in the media about the Saudis lobbying for military action against Iran are absolutely unfounded, and that have been categorically rejected by all Saudi interlocutors that we've been speaking to over the last couple of days. So I don't find that credible at all, and it doesn't really add up with Saudi behavior. But for the Israelis, where things are going is great. The Israelis don't care that this will leave potentially Iran in a bit of a limbo, that the degradation will lead to domestic insecurity, that you might potentially have an uprising here and there. I think what Israel would really hope for is a bit of elite friction, where certain elements of the IRGC might split. You have infighting in the elite, creating chaos, maybe even a civil war. That, I think, is something Israel would be very much interested in, because it would completely destabilize Iran from the inside out. And obviously, the ramification of a collapse of Iran, if it was to happen, at the moment it doesn't look like it, then this is something that would help the overall Israeli strategy, because they wouldn't have to deal with the ramifications and the fallout from such instability, but the Gulf would. And so in many ways, I'd say that what's happening right now is that Israel is fighting Iran to the last Gulfie, and they're quite happy for the Gulf to be collateral damage and for them to absorbing quite a lot of that burden of that war.
Okay, you mentioned, I mean, Trump has said that he hopes that the war will be 4 to 5 weeks, but if required, it may go longer. Now, assuming it does last 4 to 5 weeks, what do you think his objectives will be in terms of trying to achieve in those 4 to 5 weeks, and what are the chances that it does go longer than that?
Even 4 to 5 weeks is quite a stretch. I don't think the American supply chain is set up for a long war like this, especially at current intensity. If you look at how many sorties they're flying, how much ordnance they're dropping, and considering that they're doing it with 2 aircraft carriers and obviously a couple of bases in Israel, it's not a very sustainable operation across quite a vast spectrum, a vast geographic area that is Iran. I do think that time works at the moment in favor of Iran, because all Iran has to do is survive in order to win. What America has to do to win is actually provide a very credible victory narrative that is showing that clear objectives were achieved. At the moment, it's very, Trump and the Trump administration is very ambiguous about what it is that they want. You have Trump saying we want regime change. Then you have Hegseth saying, we're quite happy with degradation. Then you have quite an apologetic Marco Rubio yesterday saying, this war was forced upon us by Israel. We didn't really want it, but we had no choice, which all suggests that Trump is not in it because he's actually convinced that this was a good course of action. It seems like they were pulled into it and dragged into it by the Israelis. I obviously very much reject the fact that they didn't have a choice. America is a great power. Israel is a microstate. So if they really wanted to, they always have a choice. But the problem is, I don't think they've thought it through. And all the intelligence people in the professionals in the military, the strategic decision makers in the deep state, so to speak, people who are actually professionals in this realm of strategy making and statecraft, have all been objecting to this war, saying this is an unachievable goal if regime change was the goal. If degradation in itself is also not a strategic end game, because where does degradation end? When do you know you've basically achieved sufficient degradation, leaving the regime in place and allowing it to basically bounce back, which is the lawn mowing sort of mentality that Israel has displayed, and I think has displayed very unsuccessfully. I think the lawn mowing in Iran, in Iran, in Lebanon, and with Hamas, has had the opposite effect. It actually has emboldened these actors over time, because Israel never addressed the root cause of the problem. And regime change is not something that can be achieved by air power alone. I mean, there's a long history of air power operations trying to achieve regime change. But when they succeeded, and I would make the argument over the last 100 years, regime change has rarely succeeded, but it certainly never succeeded when it was solely done from the air without boots on the ground. And so Hegseth yesterday was saying, maybe boots on the ground is an option that we're considering. I cannot see it. And also, we shouldn't forget that this war in America is extremely unpopular. It really goes against the grain of what MAGA was all about. It's against America first. It's against the main ticket on which Trump was running as being the peace president. it obviously has now ramifications for the energy markets. So as this war continues, if the LNG stop of LNG exports from Qatar will continue, LNG markets will explode. I mean, energy markets and energy supplies globally will be under immense strain. There's still an option for Saudi to potentially stop some of their exports, which will drive up barrel oil prices above $150 a barrel. These are things that the US Treasury will not be able to compensate for. This is what people will feel at the pump in America. And so I can't see how Trump can sustain this domestically as well, let alone, obviously, a growing pressure from the Gulf states, who are the main investors. They're the net contributors to American power in this part of the world, all pulling out, putting pressure, not cooperating. So I think for Trump, he's in a bit of a pickle right now, because he has absolutely failed to strategically anticipate how this war was going to go.
Okay, so earlier on you mentioned all Iran has to do is survive. What does survival for them kind of look like? I mean, will it mean, because I mean their leadership's been decapitated. Obviously, they have many leaders in the ranks, but there's probably a lot of confusion and disarray because there's uncertainty, probably even in Iran, over how many leaders have been killed. The IRGC, you've been saying that the Israelis are probably trying to get them to sort of have a split. We've spoken about how there is a split between, I mean, there's always been a split in the IRGC between making it very simple between moderates and those who are hardliners. But what does survival? I mean, assuming Iran does see the next 2 or 3 weeks through, what will still be left of the state, and how will they be able to still sort of have a cohesive leadership?
Well, cohesive leadership is going to be difficult at the moment. As I said, everything is decentralized. Everything is run from the bottom up rather than from the top down. There will be people in the IGC who'll have to come up with a solution to the current problem. Do they want to continue to be a theocracy? Are they going to shift towards more of an IRGC-led, more military dictatorship than theocracy? And what role will theocrats play? So they do need, obviously, the ulama, they need the mullahs, they need the religious scholars to legitimize the rule of this quote-unquote Islamic Republic. But the question is, do they need someone who will actually dictate the terms? Will they have someone of the stature of Khamenei and Khomeini, who were, religious political leaders who gave an aura of religious legitimacy to the very social political setup? Or are they just appointing a figurehead who will be a kind of weak arbiter, but actually only provides a veneer of legitimacy, when in reality everything is run by the IRGC? And that also happens within the context of massive public socio-political alienation and grievances in the public. I think that probably, and numbers are very hard to come by, but if you would ask me, I'd probably say that 70% of the Iranians fundamentally reject the Islamic Republic. And so that leaves this to be a minority state anyway. If that wants to reconstitute itself and being more stable, it will have to give something. And so secularization is certainly something. Lifting of sanctions would be another. Socioeconomic injections of cash into the economy, lifting of sanctions would obviously help with that. These are all things that a new regime would have to do. I just don't see how the IRGC would just let go of the monopolies that they've created in the economy. And so there are a lot of different factors at play here. And it's a multipolar, non-linear development. So it's very difficult to predict. And obviously, currently, amid the war, there is a rallying around the flag for now. I mean, we've seen there have been no reports of major defections or infighting within the IRGC. I think they're standing firm right now. And without elite defection, you will not have, you won't have a regime change. But regime transformation can still happen. So the supreme leader being gone, if now the control of the mullahs decreases and the theocratic element decreases, and the IRGC will take over more of not just the security and statecraft element, but also more of the governance element, you might end up with an Islamic Republic that is neither Islamic, because the mullahs are gone, nor a republic, because it's obviously it will look more and more like a military dictatorship. But if it delivers on the short-term grievances and is able to alleviate some of the grievances Iranians have, that could be the sort of transformation in the best case scenario that people are looking for.
Okay, you mentioned the best case. It does look like a very reasonable scenario. I mean, if there's some sort of semblance of a state that's left and they're looking to kind of modernize and lift some of the sanctions, obviously there'll be, and again, I'm speaking about the Israelis here, who would really want to thwart that, right? And the result of this 3 or 4 or 5 week campaign, it could go in many directions. You're right. At the moment, they've been rallying around the flag, but there is dissatisfaction against the government. Iran is also a society, of multiple ethnicities, etc. In the event that this does sort of lead eventually, 2 or 3 months after this, or maybe even 6 months down the line, to some sort of civil war, what does that look like?
Look, a civil war, the thing that I would say it's probably going to look a lot more like Syria than looking like Libya. I mean, all of these sort of post-revolutionary scenarios or civil war scenarios that we've had in this region after the Arab Spring, none of them turned out to lead to a smooth transition. And in all cases, the West basically didn't get involved because regime change was a dirty word. So we kind of let things to its own devices. When we did get involved to do regime change, do the stabilization, do the quote unquote nation building in Iraq, it was a disaster. We tried to do it in Afghanistan. It was somewhat of a disaster. So there isn't a good recipe of how to do this effectively. Regimes don't change overnight, and don't, especially after 50 years of a very deeply ingrained resistance narrative. These sort of regimes don't just change. And like I said, the Iranian regime is not a hierarchical one. It's not one that is top heavy. It's not one that can be decapitated. It does have following. It does have a powerful narrative. It is spread across a vast spectrum of the social political scene within Iran. It is a country that it is a system, effectively, that is self-sustaining. It's one that has its own sort of income. It's involved in all aspects of the economy. It's one that controls people through force, mostly through force, but it also draws on entities such as the Basij, more than 1 million people who are locally organized in neighborhoods, who are a bit like your neighborhood watch, if you will, making sure that people are compliant with the regime. So all of that cannot just be removed through consensus and dialogue. I think if it was to be removed, it would be by force, through coercion and attrition. And attrition in all of this, and this is where we get into this degradation aspect of the US and Israeli campaign, is that attrition is something that doesn't, it will take a long time. It is extremely messy, and it could leave a different sort of areas of instability across the country, where you might have pockets of stability in certain areas, pockets of instability, particularly in the periphery, where you have ethnic minorities rising up. And I do think that the Israelis and the Americans will try to make an effort to rally minority groups, rally those with clear ethnic grievances around an effort to become their boots on the ground. If you really want regime change and you want to see it through and you don't want to put your own boots on the ground, you could look into a train and equip mission, something that basically the US has done in Afghanistan after 9/11, where they used the Northern Alliance to fight the Taliban. But we don't have that readily made organization. There isn't a warlord you can tap into. There isn't a well-organized opposition domestically with a clear figurehead. And those who are protesting, and many of them, thousands, tens of thousands probably, have been mowed down in January by the regime. These are all aggrieved families, but there were youngsters, there were students, there were merchants, there were traders, there were middle-class people. They're not fighters. And in Syria, what we had in 2011 and 2012 is we had an opposition that was built through training, equipping, money, and also diplomatic cover from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, and Turkey, who were building an opposition within in a fairly structured way. But even that was messy, and even that lasted until 2020, late 2024, for 13 years. To more than 13 years, nearly 14 years, to kind of create the regime change. So if that's what we want to do, and that's not what the Gulf states want to do, because it's messy and it's going to be instability with ripple effects for the Gulf, ripple effects for all neighboring countries, impact on maritime security in the maritime domain in the Gulf, impact on the Straits of Hormuz, and we're seeing that already. it would fundamentally challenge the business model of the Gulf, because also here is a US administration that doesn't have the stomach, the willpower, the financial depth, or the military bandwidth to commit to this messy sort of strategy. Mind you, this is taking America's bandwidth and focus of the most core essential areas of competition with China. So America cannot afford running this and seeing it through for an indefinite period of time, and neither do the Israelis, and nor do the Israelis care. I mean, the Israelis really don't care what is left in the place, as long as what they've achieved is some sort of degradation.
I mean, it's clear that Israel is committed to degradation. How committed do you think the US is to degradation? Because it would cost them a lot, and they would leave, they would obviously upset their allies in the Arab region. They'd probably, it would in the long term have those allies in the Arab region, those Gulf states, move sort of more against Israel. At least they'll start harboring lots of enmity. They already do, but it will be much more overt because, Israel would have essentially caused this big mess, and America would have assisted instead of kind of, playing for their allies in the Gulf. So how onside is America on this? Have they been dragged into it? Do they just what's their posturing?
With everything America has been doing since January 2025, there is this internal infighting between the neocons and MAGA, America First, and the neoconservatives. And that friction is playing out right now. And that it seems the neoconservatives have won when it comes to this war. Israel wanted it, the neoconservatives wanted it, and they got it. And they got this war. And basically, MAGA and America First have been losing out. And they're fuming, they're furious. There's a lot of opposition within the MAGA movement to what Trump is doing and has been doing against Iran. And I don't see this as a movement that can be reined in. I don't think we're in a situation now where Trump can just tell them, okay, we're going to go in for an indefinite period of time with ambiguous, sort of goals and objectives, going down a drain of mission creep, essentially, because that's what happens in these sort of operations. Like in Iraq in 2003, it started very firmly as a fairly successful major combat operation to get rid of the regime. And mind you, hundreds of thousands of boots in the ground, and a massive, not just an armada of air power, but a massive a sort of assemblage of military power, land, air, and sea, to help with that. That brought about a fairly swift victory. But what came afterwards, the mission creep of not knowing how to create stability and build a new socio-political setup, that has basically cracked and defeated American global power. I would probably say this is what broke 2003, and the aftermath broke America and broke America's superpower status, and led to all the problems that America is facing today domestically, from finances to political instability and polarization. Now, nobody has the stomach in America to do this. And everyone seems to be quite naive to think, we'll do a little bit of regime change and then things will naturally fall in place. Even less committed than the Bush administration was. And I cannot see Trump being able to sustain these internal pressures indefinitely. And it might well be that this decision to get involved in Iran is what will kill Trump's presidency. And it will be the biggest political defeat for him, because it will be very difficult to basically pick this up again and just come out of this successfully. And he might look for an off-ramp. He could build a narrative, and then he's quite good at that, because he's not someone who builds policy and strategy around rational decision-making. It's all about narrative. It's all about ratings. It's all about pushing a big post on Truth Social saying, mission accomplished because we degraded. Now we achieved the level of degradation. Remember how he said in June 2025, after the 12-day war, he was saying against Iran, he was saying, we obliterated their nuclear program. And now it seemingly he has to go back in to re-obliterate the nuclear program. And so it doesn't matter if it's factual or not, but he has to come up with a victory narrative that his constituency will swallow and agree with.
So, I mean, we may see a de-escalation in the war 2 or 3 or 4 weeks' time, but it doesn't sound like the intended move by Israel and the neoconservatives within America to degrade Iran will stop by any measure they may. They'll continue. It may again de-escalate, but that will probably continue for a while. That sustained, move to do that, how is it going to impact the Gulf states in the long term? Because I don't think they want to see that because of the obvious fallout. So what's that? How can you see that playing out?
I mean, the Gulf states can't keep this current status quo going for weeks on end. It's for them not being able to export oil and gas. Mind you, Qatar and the UAE can absorb these shocks. They have deep pockets. They have alternative sources of income, and they have massive reserves. Saudi Arabia is struggling economically. Bahrain is struggling economically. Kuwait has all kinds of domestic problems. So this is not a situation that is just acceptable, like a bit of fireworks and people just, sipping drinks by the pool, looking the fireworks coming in and out. This is far more serious than that. If the trade flows don't return to normal, and I'm not just talking about maritime trade, I'm also talking about flight routes. I mean, the Gulf states are key. Qatar and Dubai, or Doha and Dubai, are key nodes in global aviation for both cargo and passenger logistics and aviation. If they don't go back to normal and bounce back and open up their airspace, it will impact global communications and global trade, and it will certainly impact the very status of them being global hubs. So they cannot sustain this indefinitely. And I do think that Qatar deciding to close the LNG tap yesterday after being attacked is part of that move of saying, look, this is our leverage that we have. We are one of the leading gas producers in the world. Qatar has disproportionate power and influence in the global trade on gas. This is a weapon that they can use. Saudi seems to be thinking about oil and could be using the oil weapon as well, just like 1973. And that is, again, this is pressure that Trump will want to avoid, because at the moment, the US Treasury was saying they're willing to compensate consumers in America for higher oil prices. But what could be in the making, particularly if the Strait of Hormuz is now effectively closed, and the Chinese will be majorly impacted as well. They're major consumers of energy from the Gulf, much more than the United States and Europe. They will have an interest to make sure this doesn't last forever. So the energy weapon is a key one to rally the international community around a potential solution to this current war. And I would think that pressure will eventually come to bear on both sides. I don't think Trump is actually the problem here. I mean, Trump is probably more likely to accept an off-ramp because he kind of maneuvered himself into a quagmire that he would probably rather get out of. The problem is, how do you get the Iranians out of the current status quo? It seems like a couple of offers have been made to the Iranians to stop the war, and the Iranians have rejected it because the Iranians are saying, we're not swallowing this dictate. We want to negotiate the deal, but negotiation means concessions from both sides. We're not going to take Trump's kind of coercive diplomacy approach of just swallowing a dictate. And so how do you build that off-ramp currently that's going to be far more difficult than during the June war. But as I said before, time is on the side of the Iranians, and they think they can sustain this for longer than the Americans. And I do think that is true. I don't think Trump can afford running this war for longer than 2 weeks.
You've talked about the negotiations. Obviously, this was started by the U.S. even though Iran had made major like massive concessions in terms of uranium enrichment. They basically said we're not going to enrich uranium, and we'll do what we can to ensure that there's transparency around that. But the U.S. went ahead anyway, which is probably why that it's very difficult now for the Iranians to come back to the table, and why they don't want to stop this. What do you think the sticky point was for the U.S.? Do you just think they were going to do this anyway, or do you think they wanted more from the Iranians? Did they want to stop the ballistic missile program, which is clearly something they wouldn't do, because then they wouldn't have the leverage that they're just showing us right now, even though it's not by our estimates being used smartly or responsibly. So why did the U.S. do this anyway? I mean, they've done this all the time, so it's not surprising, and they've done this in many places. It's what powers do. But specifically, what did they want something more, or were they just going to go and attack anyway?
No, I think you're overestimating how independent and autonomous America is making its foreign and security policy in the Middle East. It's quite clear now, and I mean, the Trump administration is saying it quite openly. This is not a conspiracy theory. They are saying quite openly that Israel forced their hand. The narrative is, and I don't think it's a narrative, what happened was Trump and his mediators had committed to Qatar and to Oman and Saudi and Egypt and Turkey and everyone else who said, let's come up with a diplomatic solution to it. Let's build a deal. And first step, nuclear program. Second step, we're going to discuss missiles. And later on, we can talk about other things. But let's just focus on the nuclear issue first. That was agreed upon. Witkoff was on board. Kushner was on board. Trump allegedly was on board. So the only intervening variable was Israel. They're the ones who've mobilized information networks. They have been lobbying their AIPAC-funded lawmakers in America to put pressure on the White House of saying, no, we need a war. There's only a military solution. We cannot accept the missile program to continue. And Trump initially pushed back against it, saying, no, we'll deal with it when the time is ripe. But then Netanyahu forced himself on the White House. Obviously, the meetings happened. Netanyahu has said very clearly, if you don't take action against the missile program, we will. And we are not able to wait because that window of opportunity to make a move and destroy the missile program, that window of opportunity is closing very quickly. So mind you, if they had agreed to a memorandum of understanding for a deal, by that time, a military solution to the conflict would have been basically off the table. And the Americans still were at this point committed to the negotiation. Israel then came in and said, if we go first, you will look weak because we will strike Iran and you will have to come to our aid because we will be subjective to incoming fire, as would be the Gulf states. And so America was saying, okay, well, if we have two choices here. Either we just follow Israel after they take the lead, after which we will look weak because it looks like we weren't protecting the Israelis, but we will get sucked in anyway. Or we start with the Israelis together, go on the offensive and look as if we are the ones who are owning it. Obviously, there is a third choice, and the third choice would tell this small microstate, Israel, that is basically entirely dependent on US aid, US money, tell them to, to stop, or else. And or else would be no more support, no more intercepting missiles, no more military aid, or else. I mean, America could have gone down a different path, but they chose not to. And that just shows you how much leverage the Israel lobby collectively has over Washington. And they certainly got their way. But this is not because Trump didn't believe in diplomacy. Trump is very naive to think that a little bit of war will make diplomacy easier. He will see now that little bit of war has actually caused a major regional conflict that makes diplomacy now not impossible, but certainly will make it far more difficult. But it also goes to, it kind of reassures me a little bit of saying that Trump, or thinking that Trump is not going to see it through. He doesn't want regime change. I think the main victory narrative that he will eventually build will be around saying, we degraded the ballistic missile system. Now we're ready to negotiate. We degraded their nuclear program. Now we're ready to negotiate. And eventually this war will end with some sort of deal. But it will come, I think, more at the choosing of Iran than the choosing of America.
Given, in the most likely scenario that you see playing out, whatever that may be, do you see this further degrading the relationship between the U.S. and Israel? Because there'll be some reflection after this. By the Americans, and they'll be like, we got suckered into this, and this is after Israel has brought major reputational damage to the USA and itself through the genocide in Gaza. The Arab Gulf states, all of them, even the UAE, will probably be upset with Israel for bringing this war on. Will say that and express that to American diplomats and officials. How do you see this war eventually, in the likely scenario, and not in the event that it goes really, really into a hectic state? How do you see that relationship degrading at all?
I think this has been factored in already into Israeli decision making. The Israelis are well aware that their status in Washington is on the decline, and it's irreversible and it's irreparable. There is no way Israel is bouncing back into being a normal democracy and a normal partner. The neoconservatives, the AIPAC-funded lobbyists, obviously, and also lawmakers, they will side with Israel for now. But even AIPAC obviously becomes an extremely toxic term. Being affiliated with AIPAC now, even in the midterms and the next presidential elections, it will be it will be a not a badge of honor. It will be a stain on your reputation. And so Israel knows that their star is on the way down in America, and they understand that they have their opportunity to still instrumentalize and use America to get their way. That opportunity was shrinking. That moment for them to exploit this power that they had in America, that was on the decline. And it's quite clear. There will be a day of reckoning, and we're seeing it already within the MAGA discourse. If you look at the America First people, the Tucker Carlson, you look at Steve Bannon, you look at Eric Prince. There were a lot of videos and podcasts that came out over the last 72 hours where those people at the heart of the MAGA constituency were expressing their disappointment and their frustration with the Trump administration. And so that is something that will not be easily repairable. And it will further reinforce the anti-Israel sentiments within the MAGA crowd, because it just confirms all the conspiracy theories. It confirms all these observations that Israel has a disproportionate influence over policymaking and statecraft in the United States. And I think that will be something, and Israel doesn't care, obviously. Israel is still in this bunker mentality. It's us against the world. If you're against us, if you're either with us or you're against us. And so in that mentality, they don't really care, because they're so short-term and laser focused on national security interests, or what Israel believes to be national security interests, that they don't really care about the rest. They think they can manage the chaos that they've created since the 7th of October in the region, with or without American support. I think that's extremely naive. But I also think it's naive to think that America would just withdraw the support fully from Israel. I think it will be more conditional, more strings attached. And, the next 2-3 elections, midterm, but also presidential elections, will show a major shift away from Israel and apex control as well. So I think Israel is certainly going to lose in the mid to long term because of this war.
Final question. We've talked about how the obviously the leadership within the IRGC and other leading figures within Iran have been killed. They've decentralized their military strategy at the moment. Assuming this ends in 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, as we are all probably are hoping for, how do you see the likelihood of a coherent governance again in Iran taking place, given that the government already is extremely unpopular? Just what's the, not from a perspective of whether they're going to go sanctions or whether they're going to be hardliners or whether they're going to be moderates, irrespective of what they are, do you think they'll actually be able to be cohesive and actually have a state have a coherent bureaucracy left to actually run a state?
I think the bureaucracy is still in place. Bureaucracies don't just change. I mean, there have been a lot of casualties. I think the Israelis were saying 1,600 IGC officers were killed over the last 72 hours. These are massive operations. These are big systems, big hierarchies, big bureaucracies as well. They don't just shift and change. If you go back to Nazi Germany, after World War II, denazification was really a rudimentary thing. It's a peripheral thing that they were doing. It wasn't something that was done properly, because they had to get rid of 8 million people. The mistake that was made in Iraq in 2003 was getting rid of anyone who had ever anything to do with the Ba'ath Party, which then made overnight 350,000 people unemployed, plus their families, being outsiders of the new system that was built. So whatever system is going to be built is going to be drawing on a bureaucracy that is in Iran's case quite secular, quite detached from this sort of ideological or theocratic element of the Islamic Republic. Mind you, it's a country that has different layers. It's a state that has different layers. It has a theocratic, bureaucratic one as well, and they exist in parallel. The government as well is fairly, obviously not democratically elected, not in terms of a liberal democracy, but there are elections. There is a parliament. It's obviously not a very powerful government, but it is a government that has some support from the people. And so there are mechanisms for election in the country. So with some constitutional changes, with some changes as to the power of these theocratic elements in the system, you could maintain the current system, the current bureaucracy, and build a new coherent governance system if that if this war lasts a week or 10 days, that degradation can be absorbed. And I think instead of saying the Islamic Republic is going to bounce back, I think they're going to bounce forward in a way of changing into something new. And that is the sort of transformation that I think is most likely. But obviously, over time, as I said, time plays in Iran's favor. But there comes a moment where degradation, if continuously done over weeks and weeks and weeks on end, there comes a point where this degradation will lead to the complete erosion of the core cohesion of the bureaucracy. But we're not there yet. And so my guess would still be that the bureaucracy and the system as such will survive.
Okay. Andreas Krieg, thank you so much for your time, and best of luck with your day.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you. Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.